Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So what I wanted to talk about today is how to care for baby crested geckos and adult crested geckos. They're very similar, so I thought I'd make a care video for you guys today. As I said, I was going to do one a while ago, I think. So we're just going to be covering some of the main topics like housing, substrate, temperature, heating and lighting, humidity, feeding, and just kind of some other basic things that you guys should know about crested geckos, but let's get right into it. Housing crested geckos is pretty simple. They don't need very much. Obviously, since they're a climbing gecko, you're going to want a taller enclosure versus a more long and flat one. So a tall enclosure is pretty much necessary for crested geckos. As far as cage size itself goes, there's a lot of debate that goes on online whether an adult crested gecko can live in a 12 by 12 by 18 terrarium like an Exoterra tank, or if they need an 18 by 18 by 24. And personally, I think that generally speaking, more space is better, so I think that one adult crested gecko would be okay in an 18 by 18 by 24. I definitely wouldn't try and put an adult crested gecko in a 12 by 12 by 18. That just seems like it would be too small. I mean, there's some people who obviously do that and have luck, but is your animal really going to be as happy? It's kind of debatable. So having a bigger cage, if you can afford it, is always better. I'd always recommend you size up if you can. But I think definitely an 18 by 18 by 24 is like pretty much the bare minimum that you can have for an adult crested gecko. As far as baby crested geckos go, there's some people who say, you should keep them in a critter keeper or a very small tank. And I think that's true to some extent, but I don't think they're going to die if you say put them in a 10 gallon. Personally, I have my baby in a 10 gallon right now and he's doing great. So I mean, I think generally speaking most reptiles are going to be fine in 10 gallons starting off. I start all the reptiles I've had in 10 gallons and I've never had a problem, but that's just personal experience, so you can take that however you want, but I think a 10 gallon for a baby is fine. If you're not going to get an Exoterra tank for an adult, a 29 gallon ish or maybe a 20 gallon stood up would be fine. 29 gallon would be good because then you don't have to stand it on its side. Obviously you're going to want the height, so if you do a 20 long you're going to want to stand it up rather than having it lay down flat, because that's not good for crested geckos. There's also some debate whether you should be using a glass tank or a screen tank, and because crested geckos like it more humid, so obviously you're going to want the humidity to stay in the tank, and obviously a screen tank wouldn't allow that. So my personal experience on this is if you have a screen cage, you need to mist your gecko a lot more than you would if you have a glass cage. If you have a glass cage, at least the water is going to stay in there, or the moisture is going to stay in there a little bit better. If you have a screen cage and obviously there's no walls on a screen cage, it's going to come out pretty fast. So you're either going to want a lot of plants in there where you can hold the moisture, or like moss and stuff like that where it really holds the moisture. And if you, because screen cages obviously are a lot cheaper than regular cages, so getting a screen cage if you're on a budget is a good idea, but you might want to either block some of the sides or just make sure that you're misting it enough so that they have the proper humidity. As far as substrate goes for crested geckos, it's like many other reptiles. They will be fine on things like eco earth or other types of soils, leaf litter, stuff like that. You're going to want something that obviously holds moisture. Now for personal preference, I use paper towel for my baby just so he doesn't impact himself by eating any like dirts or anything when he's trying to catch crickets, just because I don't want him impacting anything or getting impacted when he's a little baby. When he gets bigger, I'll probably change him over to more like an actual substrate once I'm feeding him more reptile dishes rather than live bug. As far as temperature and heating and stuff goes for crested geckos, it's very simple. They are a nocturnal gecko, so they don't need light at all, but you're not going to want to obviously keep them in like a pitch black room. If they just get some ambient light from your room or from windows or whatever, that's not going to hurt them either. You just don't want to have them living in like pitch black, but that's again with no animal. You don't want them to be living in the dark like that, but they don't need any special lights or anything like that. And as far as heating goes, you don't really need anything either. Most geckos, depending on where you live, are going to be fine at room temperature. Most crested geckos can tolerate between about 65 and 85. Obviously you don't want to keep them all the way at 65 all the time or all the way at 85 all the time, as it'll stress them out. Best range to keep them in is probably 70 to 80 degrees, maybe 70 to 78-ish. If you can keep them in that, they'll do fine. That's the nice thing about them, that they don't need any heat pads or anything like that. Now as far as humidity goes for crested geckos, you're going to want to keep it above 50% at all times. I personally, mine stays at around 60-65%. And it sometimes gets higher, maybe a little bit lower, but I try to keep it around that general range, and he seems to be doing fine. I mist mine usually 2 or 3 times a day. He's in a glass enclosure, so that actually holds pretty well. But you're going to want to keep it above 50% for sure. I would not let it go below that. Um, Ideally, you want them to be able to drink the moisture off the walls too, because that's how they eat, or that's how they drink. So you're gonna want to make sure that when you're misting, you're getting enough like actual water in there that where they can drink it if they need to or if they want to. So that's just something also to keep in mind when you're misting the tank. Another one of my favorite things about crested geckos is that they don't need to eat live food all the time if you don't want them to. They can actually eat Crested Gecko diet. I personally buy Pangea Crested Gecko diet. I haven't tried anything else, so I wouldn't know how good that is. But the Pangea stuff seems to actually work really well. I've seen them eating it plenty of times. These feeding diets are just like a mixture of like dried fruits and stuff. You can read the ingredients on Pangea's website if that's where you're deciding to buy food from. But it's just like a Crested Gecko diet that they can eat instead of having to eat like say mealworms or crickets or something like that. Obviously it's not good for any animal to eat the same thing repeatedly over and over and over and over again. So you might want to switch it up every now and then, you know, Pangea diet one day and then give them crickets the next day, just so that they have a varied diet so that they're not eating the same thing repeatedly. Obviously, if you were a human and you were eating the same thing every day, that wouldn't, one, be good for you, and two, you'd get so bored and want to die. So just make sure you're switching it up a little bit so that they're not getting bored of what they're eating, and just so that they have a varied diet, like I said. Now, when it comes to the amount of food you should be feeding your gecko, it depends really on what size your gecko is. Obviously, an adult gecko doesn't need to eat as much as a baby gecko does. So I give my baby crested gecko food every day, and if he wants to eat it, that's fine. If he doesn't want to eat it, that's fine too. He can just leave it in there, and obviously he won't eat it. But I do offer it to him in case he is hungry and he does want to eat. Obviously, I've been switching between Pangea diet and live baby crickets or live small crickets. Now, an adult might eat every other day or every 2 days, depending on many other factors. So it's really up to you what you want to do with that. You definitely want to be feeding them at least 3 to 4 times per week. Or more, preferably more. I just offer food all the time and they can eat whenever they're hungry, or my baby can eat whenever he's hungry. So that's really what I do. I would just make sure you're not starving your gecko. Obviously, you don't want to starve any animal, but just make sure you're not starving them. If you put food in there and it doesn't look like they're eating it, you don't actually know if they're going to be eating it or not. Maybe they're just eating small amounts at a time. My baby gecko, it looks like he wouldn't be eating anything, but I've seen him licking up quite a lot of the Pangea diet. So, you know, you never know. I would just offer food whenever you can. Obviously, more than 3 to 4 times a week, probably 5 times a week, I would offer food. If it's an adult crested gecko, maybe not as many, but for a baby, definitely 5 times minimum, just so that they're getting the proper nutrition that they need. As far as water goes too, kind of with the whole food thing, like I said earlier, that the geckos actually drink off of like plants and decor, or like off the sides of the tank or whatever when you're misting it, so make sure you're misting it enough too. You want to mist at least 2 to 3 times a day, depending on where you live, how dry it is, and things like that. I personally mist mine 3 times a day, sometimes 2 if I forget one or I'm not home or something, but I always mist him at least 2 times a day so that he has enough moisture and stuff to drink. So you're going to want to mist him at least 2 times a day. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today is kind of like handling crested geckos and how they can lose their tails and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into any breeding or anything in this video, just because obviously, for one, I haven't bred any crested geckos in my life, and 2, just because I'm not knowledgeable in that. I don't know anything about it. Maybe eventually, far down the future, if I breed crested geckos, I'll make a breeding crested gecko video. It's unlikely, but I don't want to get into that today. But like I said, handling crested geckos is pretty easy. As far as babies go, I wouldn't really recommend handling them too much. Babies are a lot more skittish and a lot more shy than the adult crested geckos are. Adult crested geckos are great. I mean, you can handle them all the time. They're kind of like a leopard gecko in a way. Leopard geckos and crested geckos kind of go together because they're more popular and kind of more handleable than other geckos. But adult crested geckos are fine with handling. You can probably handle them once a day or once every other day or more, depending on your gecko. It really just depends on how your gecko is, and what it comes down to is if they're getting stressed out. Obviously, I wouldn't say any animal likes to be handled, but I would say they more tolerate it. I mean, they're not going to bite you or anything if you pick them up or something, but I wouldn't say that they necessarily like it. So just not stress out your animal. I just wouldn't handle them more than once a day if you can. I mean, obviously, let's say it's a week and you're handling them. There's one day where you handle them 3 times in that day. Obviously, that's not going to probably kill your gecko, but you don't want to do that every day because that would stress them out a lot, and that wouldn't obviously be good for the health of your gecko or his mental well-being. Another thing that comes with handling is generally associated with it anyway is tail loss. Now, I haven't experienced this firsthand, which is good for me obviously, but crested geckos aren't really affected if they lose their tails. I know leopard geckos, when they drop them, they either grow back really funny or just like really deformed. So crested geckos won't grow their tails back, and that's something different about them from leopard geckos. They once they fall off, they're gone. It doesn't affect them like leopard geckos, because leopard geckos store all their fat in their tail. So if you are handling your crested gecko and the tail falls off or something, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Generally it's not a problem, and they don't really need it anyway, so they'll do just fine without it, is what I'm saying. So you don't have to really worry about that. But I hope you guys did enjoy this crested gecko care video. This video you could use for babies or adult crested geckos. They're very similar. Babies just take a little bit more care than the adults do, but it's still pretty similar either way. So I hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did, please leave a like on it. If you're new here, please hit the subscribe button. We're getting close to 50 subscribers. So if you guys could do that, that'd be great. Anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy it, and I will see you guys in the next video.